Welcome to Flipped Classroom. Today's lesson is on the case for reparations. This is part 2 of the book talk. Let's start with chapter 4, the ills that slavery freed us from. In this chapter, Ta-Nehisi Coates presents the question, why is America prosperous in the 21st century? The answer to this question is slaves. It is because slaves were abused that today the United States is a country of prosperity, education, wealth, and a high quality of life. On page 586, blacks became early America's indispensable working class, fit for maximum exploitation, capable of only minimal resistance. He goes on to write, America law worked to reduce black people to a class of untouchables. Further down on the page, in 1860, slaves as an asset were worth more than all of America's manufacturing, all of the railroads, all of the productive capacity of the United States put together. And he describes them as a financial asset of property. On these pages, he describes how much slaves contributed to the United States through their free labor, hard work, abuse, and separation from family members. On page 587, Ta-Nehisi Coates explains, as a result of their abuse, the white people had lots more time for their own pursuits, for their own education. They were less tired because the whites were not doing the back-breaking labor. They had the support of family with strong family bonds that black people were not allowed to have when children and wives were ripped away from spouses. This allowed white people to have time to be creative and invent all the technologies that pushed our country forward. So it wasn't that the black people were lazy or chose to be uneducated or were less creative. No, it's just white people had more opportunities. Coates ends the chapter by saying, on 587, the destruction was not incidental to America's rise. So it is thanks to what the slaves contributed that the United States is so prosperous today. In chapter 5, The Quiet Plunder, Coates presents the question, who made the second ghetto? Was it individuals or was it the government? He writes about redlining. He says on page 590, the federal government concurred. It was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, not a private trade association, that pioneered the practice of redlining, selectively granting loans and insisting that any property it insured be covered by a restrictive covenant, a clause in the deed forbidding the sale of the property to anyone other than whites. Millions of dollars flowed from tax coffers into segregated white neighborhoods. So redlining is an industry action supported by the government that kept black people from the best homes. And when that didn't work, then individuals took it upon themselves to make sure that blacks and whites were segregated. This is called white flight. On page 592, when terrorism failed, white homeowners simply fled the neighborhood. The traditional terminology, white flight, implies a kind of natural expression of preference. In fact, white flight was a triumph of social engineering orchestrated by the shared racist presumptions of America's public and private sectors. So white people would leave any neighborhood where there were blacks so that the white people could live in one neighborhood and not have blacks as their neighbors. This created a second ghetto. In chapter 7, Toward a New Country, Ta-Nehisi Coates assumes that now you agree with the evidence he's provided and asks the question, what should be done? This is his call to action. He asks, should money be a form of reparations? Should it be opportunities? Who should it go to? The black people, poor people, abused people, or an acknowledgement? He starts the chapter with some numbers. He says, A rough price tag for reparations could be determined by multiplying the number of African Americans in the population by the difference in white and black per capita. That number, $34 billion in 1973. Okay, obviously, 1973 from 2020, the number would be far, far higher due to inflation. On page 593, he writes, today Charles Ogletree, the Harvard Law School professor, argues for something broader than money, a program of job training and public works that takes racial justice as its mission, but includes the poor of all races. So in this case, it wouldn't be just narrowed down to black people. It's a much broader group. On the bottom of 593, the idea of reparations is frightening, not simply because we might lack the ability to pay. The idea of reparations threatens something much deeper: Americans' heritage, history, and standing in the world. On page 594, Ta-Nehisi Coates goes on to point out, Black history does not flatter American democracy. It chastens it. So Ta-Nehisi Coates argues for full acceptance of our collective biography and its consequences. He goes on to say, what is needed is an airing of family secrets, a settling with old ghosts. What is needed is a healing of the American psyche and the banishment of white guilt. What I'm talking about is more than recompense for past injustices, more than a handout, a payoff, hush money, or a reluctant bribe. What I'm talking about is a national reckoning that would lead to spiritual renewal. Reparations would mean a revolution of the American consciousness, a reconciling of our self-image as the great democratizer with the facts of our history. At the end of 595, he writes, more important than any single check cut to any African American, the payment of reparations would represent America's maturation out of a childhood myth of its innocence into a wisdom worthy of its founders. So what he's arguing for is not necessarily money or opportunity or for a very specific group, but he wants acknowledgement for the United States to say, yes, our society has treated Black people horrifically. And it didn't end with slavery. It continued through, all the way through till today. So are you convinced? What evidence was the strongest? What evidence was the weakest? Did Ta-Nehisi Coates cherry pick evidence, leaving some out? That's for you to decide at this point. And that is the question I will be asking you in class. Do you agree? Does the United States of America need a reparations program? Thank you for joining me today in Flip Classroom.